Hello, Year 10, and welcome to your next lesson, focusing on your Power and Conflict GCSE poetry. Today, we're going to be doing the first lesson on the poem Poppies by Jane Ware. All right, so it is Tuesday, the 2nd of February today. Poppies Part 1 is your title, and there is the quiz there on the board for you to complete. All right, question number 1, what is imagery? Number 2, what does the use of free verse in Kamikaze reflect? Number 3, how does the narrative of Kamikaze change throughout the poem? Number 4, how is the power of nature illuminated in Kamikaze? And then why is the sunrise in Kamikaze significant? Make sure you've got all the tools you need, pen, paper, etc., copies of the poem, if you've been able to get yourself copies of those. Get the date and title written down, have a go at that retrieval quiz, pause the video, play again when you're ready to go through the answers. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to go through the answers to those questions now. Hopefully you've managed to have a go at all of those. Please do mark your answers, okay, as we go through them. So I did ask you to answer in full sentences as well. So the answers I've given here are done. So question number 1 was, what is imagery? That's something from your definition, your key terminology table that you've been building over the last few lessons. Imagery is visually descriptive or figurative language, okay? It's essentially any words that have been put together, any phrases that have been put together with the aim of creating an image in the reader's mind. And it could be a literal description of the grass is green, the car was blue, all right, to help the reader build that image, or it could be figurative, it could be metaphorical, you could be using similes to help the reader to build that image in their mind. Number 2, what does the use of free verse in Kamikaze reflect? The use of free verse reflects natural speech, okay, and it links to how it is a story being told by a mother to her children about her father, who was the kamikaze pilot, all right, reflecting the flow of natural speech. Number 3, how does the narrative of Kamikaze change throughout the poem? It moves from a third to first person narrative. All right, and this is to reflect the conflict that the daughter herself feels about her relationship with her father. She's aware that she had to push him away because he brought dishonor to her family, but at the same time, she perhaps feels guilty or ashamed for doing so. So it does flip between the two. Number 4, how is the power of nature illuminated in Kamikaze? The power of nature is illuminated through the natural imagery included in the poem, okay, so descriptions of nature. And it is suggested that it was because of the effect that nature had on the pilot that he turned around. Right, he began to take note of all of his natural surroundings while he was in the plane. He began to see how beautiful it was, and he began to wonder, why would I deprive anybody of experiencing this? And the daughter imagines that is something that helped him decide to turn around and come back again. And number 5, why is the sunrise in Kamikaze significant? Not only is the sunrise another link to nature, all right, linking you with that natural imagery that features in the poem a lot, but it also links to the Japanese military flag. In this situation, we again find the military and nature in conflict. All right, power of man, power of nature coming up against each other, and nature's winning. Wonderful. Once you finish marking your answers, we'll carry on through. So Poppies, part 1. Today's aims are to understand some contextual details about the poet, to understand what the poem is about, and to explore the form and structure of the poem, taking a very similar structure to other lessons, focusing on the other poems because we're looking at the same sort of areas and just seeing what each poem does differently. First things first, though, I have some more key terminology for you to add to your glossaries that you've been building over the last couple of weeks. All right, 2 new terms for you. The first one is a dramatic monologue, and this is a type of form that a poem can take. So it's a form of poetry where the poet takes on the persona of a character speaking to someone else, but we never hear from the person being spoken to. All right, essentially, you hear them in the poem, they are talking to somebody, but you don't know who. You never hear from the other side. And the second term there is a semantic field, which is a lexical set of words grouped together by topic or meaning. So, for example, you might get a semantic field of war or injury, childhood, things like that. So they're all words that, when you group them together, are associated with this one thing. Pause the video, get those added down to your table, and carry on when you're ready. But for now, I will move on. Looking at the poet first, as always, Jane Ware is the writer of Poppies, okay? She was born in 1963 and she grew up in both Italy and England. She lived in Ireland during the 1980s, so she would have experienced the Troubles in Ireland at this time. And just for a bit of extra context, over in the green box over here, the Troubles refers to a period of conflict that took place in Northern Ireland between 1960 and 1990, which can also be known as the Northern Ireland conflict. The Unionists wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK, but the Nationalists did not. Okay, it was a conflict over whether or not Northern Ireland should become part of mainland Ireland or still be classified as part of the UK. Jane Ware was also a textile designer and poet, and a lot of imagery links to textiles is present in her work. Okay, we will get references to materials and things like that. And interestingly, one thing she's noted as saying is that the principal motive is language itself within her work, its mutability in representing both the abstract or the real. And what she's saying here, she finds herself interested in how words can be used to both describe things literally and see, you know, things as they are, but also how language can be used in a more abstract sense, in where you can describe things a bit more metaphorically, a bit more figuratively. And we will see examples of both coming into her work. And the final bullet point there, her use of language can be both domestic, but it also contains deeper meaning. And we'll look at that in more detail when we come to look at the language of the poem in the second lesson. Pause, make notes, blue annotate cloud is there, and then carry on. So a bit of context about the poem. You don't necessarily need to write this down, but these are just really good things to be aware of. Poppies comes from a collection that Carol Ann Duffy, who's another poet that features within the anthology, put together in 2009 called Exit Wounds, that contained poems about war. And Jane Ware was asked to contribute. And this is some information from Jane Ware herself here at the bottom. I wrote the piece from a woman's perspective, which is quite rare. As the mother of 2 teenage boys, I tried to put across how I might feel if they were fighting in a war zone. I wanted to write a poem from the point of view of a mother and her relationship with her son, who was loved, cherished, and protected. And it had led to this heightened and absolute fear that parents experience in letting their children go, the anxiety and ultimately the pain of loss. I hope to somehow channel all this, convey it into something concise and contemporary, but also historically classic in terms of universal experience. There, Jane Ware is listing what her motivations were behind this poem, what her thoughts were, all right? And what she's saying is within the poem, she was trying to present the perspective of a mother, all right? So not of a soldier themselves or actually describe any of the soldiers' experiences, but solely the experiences of the mother who has watched her son leave. Okay, and we will look at that in more detail as we move through looking at the poem, how this all kind of comes into play through the use of form, structure, and language. And a bit more context to give you about the poem Poppies. So Poppies obviously linked to Armistice Day, which is a day that began as a way of marking the end of World War I in 1918. It was set up so that people could remember the hundreds and thousands of people who'd been killed. But today it is used to remember soldiers of all wars that have died since then. Okay, so in this sense, poppies are symbolic of this day of remembrance. Poppies are used to commemorate Armistice Day because they are the flowers that grew on the battlefields after World War I ended. Okay, that's why poppies are used as the symbol. Interestingly, putting the little green cloud down here, this is described in the poem In Flanders Field by John McCrae. This isn't an anthology poem, but it's a beautiful poem nonetheless that has those links to remembrance and poppies and whatnot, and talking about information and events from World War I. Blue annotate bubble, please do make sure we get these notes down. I will continue though. Oh yeah, I just wanted to reference this. You might remember a few years ago this memorial statue appearing on Plymouth Hoe. And this was part of a memorial that made its way around the country over the span of 4 years, I believe. It began somewhere in 1914. It was to commemorate the 100-year anniversary of World War I starting and ending. So for 4 years, these poppies travelled around the country, all right, and were there as a public attraction for people to come and, you know, observe and, you know, as an act of remembrance. That it travelled around, but it travelled around for those full 4 years that the war would have taken place. And I believe they came to Plymouth in 2017, if I remember correctly. But either way, they were up on the Hoe. That's one of the memorial statues up on the Hoe there, with all of these metal poppies in front of them that have been laid out in that way. And I thought, yeah, just thought I'd mention it in case any of you had seen it. So what's the poem about? Read the poem on the next slide and note what you think the poem is about. I'm going to see if you can work it out a little bit before I tell you this time. I will read through the poem aloud, all right, but you can pause it, read through it yourself. I always find it handy to read poems aloud because then often things like punctuation and whatnot can really be heard, okay? And if they are going to have an impact on the poem, it's easier to tell if that is the case. All right, so I will read through it, but if you want to pause and read it by yourself as well, absolutely fine. So Poppies by Jane Ware. 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, crimped petals, spasms of paper red, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Sellotape bandaged around my hand, I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could, smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play it being Eskimos like we did when you were little. I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. All my words flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door, Threw it open, the world overflowing like a treasure chest. A split second and you were away, intoxicated. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where it has led me, skirting the churchyard walls, my stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf, gloves. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial, leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. If you need to pause it to read through it, please do so now, but otherwise I'm going to just talk through it a bit more about what's going on in this poem. I will summarise on the next slide, but we'll just go through it in a bit more detail. So 3 days before Armistice Sunday, okay, so 3 days before Remembrance Day, and poppies had already been placed on individual war graves. As you may be aware, it tends to be tradition for poppies and wreaths of poppies especially to be placed on war memorials when it comes up to Armistice Sunday. Then here she begins to refer to the sun. Before you left, I pinned one onto your lapel, pinned a poppy onto his lapel, which is on a blazer. It's the, you'll have one on your school blazers. It's like the collar that comes down here. Okay, pinned one there. Crimped petals, spasms of paper red. She's describing the poppy, disrupting a blockade of yellow bias binding around your blazer. Right, and that's the material that is coating his lapel, all right, on his blazer. Next thing, we've got sellotape bandaged around my hand. I rounded up as many white cat hairs as I could. Essentially, she's taped sellotape around her hands backwards so the sticky side is facing out to pick up any cat hairs to make on his suit to make sure he looks as smart as possible. Smoothed down your shirt's upturned collar, steeled the softening of my face. Okay, she's tried to control her emotions, okay, and remain brave in this moment. I wanted to graze my nose across the tip of your nose, play it being Eskimos like we did when you were little. All right, she wanted to rub her nose against his nose. And I resisted the impulse to run my fingers through the gelled black thorns of your hair. She resisted the urge to put her hands on his hair. All my words, flattened, rolled, turned into felt, slowly melting. Okay, she felt as though she couldn't speak properly. I was brave as I walked with you to the front door. They walked to the front door. They opened the door. And they found the world to be overflowing like a treasure chest. It's a simile. We'll look at it in more detail later. A split second and you were away. He's gone. The sun is gone, intoxicated by what he's seen. After you'd gone, I went into your bedroom. So she went to his bedroom and released a songbird from its cage. Okay, we'll look at that in more detail later. Later, a single dove flew from the pear tree, and this is where he has led me. So she spotted a dove leaving a tree. She's followed it. And she's found herself skirting the churchyard walls, her stomach busy making tucks, darts, pleats, hatless, without a winter coat or reinforcements of scarf or gloves. Okay. So yeah, so her stomach is having this reaction as she's walking through the churchyard. On reaching the top of the hill, I traced the inscriptions on the war memorial. She's found the war memorial and is looking at what is written on there. And she leaned against it like a wishbone. The dove pulled freely against the sky, an ornamental stitch. I listened, hoping to hear your playground voice catching on the wind. So in summary then, what's the poem about? The poem is about a mother who pins a poppy on her son's lapel, again, that part of your blazer that I was talking about. She helps him look neat and tidy, taking the cat hairs off, things like that, smoothing down his collar. She watches him leave and she looks for evidence of him in his room. She then follows a dove to a war memorial and she looks at the names on the memorial. That is what is taking place during the poem here, okay? Next thing to look at are some of the themes that feature in the poem. And I like us to talk about these now, because then we can link what we find when we look at form, structure and language back to what we know about the themes of the poem. One of the main themes that features here is the pain and suffering of those left behind, okay? Absolutely, this is where I was focusing on within this poem. But we also have the theme of loss, the effect of conflict on others. All right, and one key thing to remember is whenever we're looking for conflict, it's always good to look for opposites in the poem, and that will come in handy to us later on. We're looking at absence, identity, individual experience, all right, conflict and war are all themes that can link to this poem here, but primarily, again, that the pain and suffering of those left behind and the effect of conflict on other people, okay? Blue annotate cloud, get those down, carry on when you're ready, but I shall continue. So the first thing we're going to look for is the form of the poem. And once again, when we're looking at form is the style in which the poem is written. Is it a sonnet? Is it a dramatic monologue? Does it contain a particular rhyme scheme which tells us that it fits a particular prescribed structure? We're looking at the features of the poem in its entirety, okay? Some poets choose to adopt a particular form, but others do not, as we've already discovered looking at some of the poems we've looked at so far. And the types of things we need to consider when we're looking at form are, does the poem have a particular form? How does this link to the ideas or message of the poem? If the poem does not have a particular form, why might this be significant? Those are the questions to consider. So The first thing I'm going to tell you here is that the form is a dramatic monologue. If you need to remind yourself of what that is, go back and look at your glossary table, as you should have added this term to that earlier on. Okay, so I will tell you that it is a dramatic monologue, but I'm going to ask you, what makes it a dramatic monologue? How do I know it's a dramatic monologue? What do you notice about the poem itself that tells you it fits the structure of a dramatic monologue? And the next thing, why might it be significant that we only hear from one person? And a little hint there, link back to the themes that we looked at, okay? And what Ware wanted to achieve with this poem. Why might it be significant we only hear from one person, with it being the format it is? Pause the video, consider those questions. I will move on in a moment. Okie dokie, moving on to the answers to these questions then, looking at the form of the poem as a dramatic monologue. So we know that it is a dramatic monologue. So Ware is writing in character. She's not writing as herself. She's taking on the perspective of somebody else. And she is addressing a silent listener, all right? Both you, as in it's meant to be the son or the soldier, okay? But it also kind of appeals to us as well. So we know that it's a dramatic monologue because we've got one person speaking to somebody else, but we never hear from this other person that she's speaking to. This form emphasizes how the poem is about the pain being caused for the often ignored mother. Obviously, when it came to war and focusing on experiences to do with war, it was often, looking at the experience of the soldier and the people who were in the war, and the really horrible experiences they had. But it was kind of considered that those who were at home, one thing we need to look at is the fact that they were affected as well. And that's what Weir's trying to do here. She's trying to maintain that perspective and look at that perspective of the people who weren't actually in the war, but who knew people who were. All right, because those people could often be seen as being ignored because they weren't the ones out on the front line doing the fighting. Okay, so this form emphasizes how the poem is about the pain being caused for the often ignored mother. It also emphasizes how the soldier is not there. Okay, this is kind of a memory. She's looking back on something that has happened previously. Whether he's off at war or dead, we don't know. Okay, and it's not necessarily important for us to know whether the son is dead or alive, or whether he's gone to war, or what. The main thing we need to be aware of is that her son is involved in some form of conflict, or has been involved in some form of conflict, and we are just looking at her perspective. Okay, we could infer that he's gone off to war by the fact that he's gone off looking really, really smart, and we could infer that she's looking back on her memories of him because he's unfortunately died as part of the war. But again, we don't know for sure, but we don't necessarily need to either. Right, blue, annotate, cloud, please do make sure you get those down. I think that's it for those notes. Oh, there's one more as well. So the poem is also written in free verse, okay? Free verse means there's no particular rhyme scheme or metrical pattern, all right? And it reflects the natural patterns of speech within the poem. Okay, so once again, she's kind of relaying a memory. She's telling a story, so to speak. It's a dramatic monologue, talking to somebody else. Blue, annotate, cloud, get those down. We'll move on to look at structure. Moving on to structure then. So as we need to remember, structure refers to the organization of the poem on the page. We're looking at the number of stanzas, line length, narrator, rhythm, enjambment, lists, repetition, caesura, any of these things that might feature. And we're not looking at the words themselves as much as how they appear on the page, okay? But zooming in a bit more than we do when we look at form. And the things we need to consider is, does the way the poem appears on the page link to its meaning? How might the number of stanzas or stanza length or length of lines be important? Is there a rhyme scheme? Is the rhyme scheme regular or varied? How does all of this information link to the poem itself and the themes and what the poem is about? And what is the rhythm or meter? All right. So what I want you to consider here are the following questions. What do you notice about the lengths of the stanzas? Make an observation. What do you notice? I will note for the screen here where it says slowly melting, that is the start of a new stanza. Okay, just in case that's not abundantly clear. Can you find examples of these two things, enjambment and caesura? If you need to remind yourself of what those are, look back at your glossary table. You should have them written on there for your convenience. And then finally, what effect does the poet's inclusion of these devices have? Considering things a bit more widely, right? If you manage to find these things, okay, and I will tell you they are in there, all right? I just want you to have a look to see if you can find them. I want you to consider, what effect does the poet's inclusion of these devices have? And when you begin to think about that question, think back to previous poems that we've looked at that contain these devices and what effect those devices have generally had on the poem when the poet has included them. Pause the video, have a look at those questions, see what you can find. Play the video again and I will go through the answers. Okay, hopefully by now you've managed to have a go at each of those questions, but let's talk about where these things feature and why they are interesting for us to look at. So you'll note, let me move over here. So the poem is written in free verse and the stanzas are all of different lengths, okay? And the poem contains both enjambment and caesura, which I will show you examples of here. So there we are. So you've got enjambment, especially in the second and third stanza, okay? It does feature in other places, but obviously enjambment when there's no end stop punctuation at the end of lines, and it does feature quite heavily in the second and third stanza. And caesura, all right, that I've highlighted on the screen here. Let's move the little box that I'm in again, just so you can see it a bit more clearly. Caesura in the highlighted points, you've got lots of caesura with end stop points, full stops in the middle of lines throughout the poem, all right? And before I move on to talk a bit more about the why, I want you to consider what effect do you think all of these elements combined has on the reader? The fact that it's in free verse, the stanzas are of different length, it contains enjambment, so the lines don't end properly, and it's got caesura as well, where suddenly lines stop in the middle. Pause a moment, have a think about that question, and then move on. Okay, so let's look at this in a bit more detail then. So all of these elements combine for a chaotic structure. All right, again, think back to previous poems we've looked at that contain enjambment and caesura and how they tend to contribute towards this sense of chaos happening within the poem. All right, this reflects the chaotic impact conflict has on those at home. Life is chaos. Those left at home are completely absorbed with these terrifying thoughts about their loved ones who are serving in wars. Okay, they don't necessarily know what might have happened to their, to their loved ones that are out there. They don't know whether they might be in danger or anything because they're at home. They know nothing about what's happening on the front line. Okay. And interestingly, Ware's use of caesura also suggests that the mother is attempting to control her thoughts and emotions, but not overly successfully, all right? The fact that it does contain some full stops and some end stop punctuation does suggest that she is trying to kind of keep things in and control what she's thinking, but she's not overly succeeding, okay? Exceeding to an extent, but not overly, because obviously it just adds to this chaos, these breaks in the middle of lines. Blue annotate cloud, get those notes down, carry on when you're ready. Moving on to the next slide then. So that is the end of the main part of the lesson for today. As always, if you have some time left for today, I would highly recommend spending some time creating some self-quizzing questions based on the content of this lesson to aid in your revision. As I've said before, if you keep making questions as you go, it means that you'll slowly build up that bank of revision information that you can use rather than leaving it all to the end, all right, when you've already covered a lot of the poems. That means you have to always remind yourself of the information. It's always good to do it while it's fresh in your mind. You might wish to create flashcards or just write them on paper, but my main advice is always to keep the answer away from the question when it comes to your self-quizzing questions. If you've got the answer in front of you when you're looking at a question, then you're not relying on your brain to actually do anything. Okay, it's not having to recall that information from the back of your head, which is what helps to strengthen your knowledge and your memory of particular things. Okay, so even if you're doing it on paper, just put the answers on another piece of paper. Right. But these are just really, really useful things to have. Otherwise, that is the end of the lesson. Poppies part 1. Today's aims were to understand some contextual details about the poet, to understand what the poem is about, and to explore the form and structure of the poem. I would say we've done all those. We looked at some contextual details about Jane Ware. We talked about what the poem is about in a bit more detail, and we explored the form as a dramatic monologue and the structure of the poem in a bit of detail. And hopefully you've managed to get all those annotations down. As much detail as possible is always excellent and an excellent thing to do. But remember, you can always do them more in your own kind of words rather than writing down absolutely everything I put on word for word. Right, so long as you know what it's about and as long as you can understand it, that is absolutely fine. But I will leave you with that. Part 2 of Poppies will be up for tomorrow's lesson. Any questions at any time, please do get in touch with your English teacher. Otherwise, stay safe, take care, and your next lesson will be up tomorrow.